Okay, so welcome back to the resumption of classes here at the University of West Georgia. This particular video is going to be about humanistic psychology. It's going to be my very first attempt to actually do an online lecture. Let's take a second to recall where we were before we were so rudely and unceremoniously interrupted by the necessity first for spring break and then for the apocalypse. So before all that happened, we were just finishing our material on Carl Rogers. So right now we're at the dividing line between the Carl Rogers stuff, which will appear on test number 2, and the stuff which will appear on test number 3, which will have to do with Abraham Maslow and Rollo May. So today's topic is Abraham Maslow, and more specifically, Abraham Maslow's farther reaches of human nature. By the way, any second now, right about here, there's going to be appearing your notes, which will also appear on Course 10 for this lecture and the succeeding lectures too. So, Abraham Maslow's The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. And because I know you students are always panting and slavering and eager for another reading assignment, there it is on the top of your notes. So, read pages 24 to 68, that's chapters 2, 3, and 4, and then skip all the way to page 270 and read to 286. So, as usual, when we look at one of these thinkers, what I like to do, in case you're not used to it by now, is go through the thinker's greatest hits, in other words, their most famous and most basic ideas, and then after that start tracking right in parallel with your reading assignment. Reason why I like to do that is because I feel like talking about a thinker's greatest hits kind of gives you the lay of the land. You kind of know where the thinker's going to go, what it's basically going to look like, and so when we start talking about his specific ideas, it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So this video is going to be about Abraham Maslow's greatest hits, as it were. But before getting into all that, to give you a sense of continuity between the Carl Rogers lectures and now the Abraham Maslow's lectures, like it says in your notes, probably the first thing to do is compare and contrast Abraham Maslow with Carl Rogers, about whom you've been hearing for quite some time now in this class. So, differences from Rogers. Abraham Maslow, although occasionally he'll talk about clinical psychology and psychotherapy, that's not his primary focus the way it is for Carl Rogers. Yeah, Carl Rogers writes books on other topics, like for instance he has a pretty famous book on education called Freedom to Learn, but still, even when Carl Rogers is talking about other topics, he always has in the back of his mind what he's learned and gleaned from psychotherapy. Abraham Maslow is not going to be like that so much, not nearly so much. His big emphasis is not on psychotherapy or clinical praxis or theory. His big emphasis is on motivation and also personality. So, two big emphases for Abraham Maslow. Now, the biggest similarity between the two, besides the fact that they're obviously both humanistic psychologists, is that they both love to talk in ontological language. In other words, to cast their ideas in terms of being and becoming and constructs like that. So that's going to be a big point of intersection between the two. So once we start talking about Abraham Maslow's ideas, it's probably going to seem pretty familiar to you because you're going to hear a lot of that ontological language that you're used to from Carl Rogers, which should make it fairly easy for you to get on board. At any rate, the first and definitely the biggest and most famous idea from Abraham Maslow, which appears in pretty much every single introductory psychology textbook across the United States, would probably obviously be his hierarchy of needs. And I'm guessing that you've all, if you're watching this video, you've probably heard of this. If not, I've provided to you a diagram, once again, over on this side of the video, also on your Course 10 notes. And in almost every introductory textbook across the United States, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is presented in the form of either a triangle or a pyramid or possibly a trapezoid, because it's sort of hard to write stuff on the very top of a pyramid. So here, over on this side of the video, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'll go through it rather quickly because it's so famous and probably you've heard about it before that probably most of the people watching this video aren't going to need a lot of detail on it. But basically, it's a theory of how human motivations follow each other in a fairly logical sequence. So when you see Maslow's hierarchy of needs and it's presented in terms of a triangle or pyramid, the way this thing works is motivations are going to be appearing first toward the bottom end of this pyramid, or in this case trapezoid, and moving up to the topmost parts of it. So think about it this way. Like if you're just sort of cast out into the wild and you don't have all the trappings of civilization and all the distractions and all of that kind of stuff, and what are you going to be worried about? Well, the first thing you're going to be worried about is making sure you can survive. So physiological needs like hunger and thirst, those are the first, you're going to be the source of your first motivations in this world. Once you get done those needs, once you more or less have secured your basic immediate survival, then safety needs come into play. So, like it says in the diagram, feeling safe, secure, the world is more or less predictable. Now, I think it's pretty interesting to be giving this lecture in the middle of the coronavirus because probably a lot of us have sort of sunk back down to that level of motivation, you know, wondering about our safety and perhaps not feeling quite so safe and secure and all of that kind of stuff. So it's sort of an interesting parallel, I guess, between this theory and the particular situation in which we're finding ourselves with respect to the coronavirus. At any rate, the bottommost third of this hierarchy of needs has to do with our physical needs. So once again, first physiological type needs, and then our needs for fairly physical safety and security and that sort of thing. The second layer of this hierarchy of needs has to do with psychological needs. So once we have our physical needs more or less met, once we're feeling like, well, survival is not at an issue for us and we feel more or less safe and secure, then the question becomes, okay, what then to do with our motivations? And the logical answer is to work on the psychological sphere. So belonging needs, love needs, a need to feel loved and accepted by others, not only love in the romantic sense, by the way, but also love in the sense of community connections, familial connections, having a good friendship type life. That also is an expression of our need for belonging and love, to feel not lonely. Once we more or less have that together, more or less, it's never an absolute. Hardly anything in psychology is an absolute, in case you haven't noticed that. But once we more or less have that together, then the question is, do we feel good about ourselves, and do we feel good about others, and do we feel good about life in its generality? So those are esteem needs. So then our motivations naturally begin to move in that direction. Once we have all the other lower levels more or less taken care of, the question is, how can we learn to think well of ourselves, well of other people, well of our existential condition? So all of that, which is, I'm trying to figure out where this diagram is going to appear next to me, maybe right about here, but possibly not. All of those constitute psychological needs. Now, at this point, you may think, well, damn, you know, if we have all of our physical needs met, if we feel sort of physiologically secure, if we feel more or less safe in a very physical, basic sense, if we feel a pretty decent sense of love and belonging and connection with other human beings, on top of that, if we feel good about ourselves, we feel good about other people, and we feel good about life generally, then it seems like we must have arrived, right? Like we must be sort of at the apex or pinnacle of what human existence has to offer. And as you may well infer from the diagram, that's not actually true according to Maslow. In a way, taking care of all of our physical needs and our psychological needs is just a kind of setup for the uppermost echelon of needs that we have as human beings, and that has to do with self-actualization. So self-actualization is a phrase that you encountered in test 1 material in this class, and it has to do with glimpsing and ultimately living toward our deepest, most luminous potentials as the unique and distinct human beings that we are. So that is ultimately what our motivations are aiming toward. And if you think about like sort of what's the real deep reason for taking care of our physical needs and then our psychological needs? Well, the whole point, according to this theory, is to get ourselves in a position where we can start to self-actualize, when we can start to enter into our deepest, most unique, most powerful, most musical, most poetic possibilities that are part and parcel of every human being's unique human birthright. That, in a way, is the deep point. You can sort of translate it, if you want, into this simple way of thinking. Like, what's the point of paying your bills? What's the point of paying your taxes? What's the point of getting through all the pragmatic details of your life? Well, if you were to sort of generalize this theory a little bit, the deep point of all that is to get to the moments in your life where you can really live out what it is you're meant to be, given that you are the unique specimen of humanity that you are, with a unique constellation of talents, abilities, and weaknesses too, a unique combination of both struggles and capacities. The point is to get to the point in your life where you can live that out in the deepest, most powerful, most interesting way that you're capable of doing it. And that's the meaning of self-actualization. Now, Maslow also makes note of the fact that sometimes, although not all the time, we'll talk about that in a lecture that's upcoming, but at least some of the times, this can include something that he calls peak experiences. So the question is, what is a peak experience? Well, if you sort of hear that word peak, like think of it this way, like a kind of topographical peak, like a high mountaintop, like maybe the Matterhorn, like often when they show peaks, you know, in pictures or sort of dramatic mountain ranges, they'll show the Matterhorn, which rises up to a very high height, and it's very steep along the sides. And sometimes our experience is sort of like that. Well, when is our experience sort of like that? Well, for the most part, it's when we sort of when we glimpse the deepest, most intense, most overwhelming things that we can possibly glimpse in this world. So religious experiences would qualify sometimes as a type of peak experience if they have that quality, like epiphanies of various sorts. There are secular versions of it too, so the sensation of being one with the universe, one with the cosmos, in harmony, or a kind of deep, sympathetic, harmonic vibration with all of life, all of humanity. These are examples of peak experiences. And as I talk about this, I hope that you're wondering a little bit about how this might apply to life as you've known it. Excuse me, there's one of those glitches that I hope wouldn't happen too often. I sort of burped in the middle of a sentence. So think back, like try to remember back, ransack your memory back into the veiled mists of time. And try to remember a experience you've had that would hopefully sort of correspond to this description, like an intense, unignorable, overwhelming experience of what you might think of as sort of the highest, most unique, most powerful, possibly spiritual sensations and perceptions and overall experience that you have had in your life. Because if you can locate something like that in your memory, then this whole idea of peak experience is going to be a lot more accessible to you and a lot more comprehensible to you, and it'll sort of make sense why it is that Maslow puts it at the top more or less of his hierarchy of needs. Because like for him, that's the point of all the pragmatic details, to get to those kinds of experiences. Like maybe you've had this sort of experience in meditation. I think that some of us have that, like a deep samadhi experience, if you're a meditator, you know, like, and you've had that sort of experience. Or if you're a Christian, let's say the sensation of deep prayer and communion with God, the kind of prayer where you're not only asking God for something or even speaking to God, but you're hearing God responding to you, like that, the sensation of sort of the intense, undeniable, overwhelming nature of that would qualify as a kind of peak experience. So that, in a nutshell, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like I said, I didn't want to go into a lot of detail about it. I'm cycling my computer forward because you probably heard about it before, but I wanted to say enough about it to rekindle your memory and get you back in touch with probably what you've already learned at some class in the past. That's definitely, probably far and away, Maslow's greatest hit, but here comes number 2 on his greatest hits collection. And it's going to have to do with a distinction between, well, let's say 2 kinds of needs. Let's put it that way for now, although he's going to use these prefixes in a whole bunch of different ways. But for now, just to sort of get you on board with it, let's draw a distinction between what he calls D needs and B needs. Now, the trick to understanding this is probably an idea that you haven't heard of before, because it doesn't appear very often in intro classes or intro textbooks. So B here, the letter B, stands for being. Oh my God, OMG, ROFL, there's that ontological language again. Good thing that I prepared you for it in the introduction to this video. So being needs are going to be about the fulfillment of our being, and it's going to pretty much map onto that self-actualization part of the hierarchy of needs. So when we're talking about B needs, we're talking about the sector of our psychological motivations that have to do with fulfilling our deepest and most unique potentials in life, and that ultimately are sort of the deep source of all of our motivations. So here's how I described it in your notes. The need to fulfill maybe that should say our being by moving towards self-actualization. Also, growing and seeking out what's fulfilling for its own sake, rather than as a way of meeting some deficiency in our lives. And then I said it maybe in a little bit of a puzzling way. I said it's a kind of positive, and I put that word positive in quotes. The reason why I put that word positive in quotes is because I don't mean positive in the sense that these are good needs, okay? Often we use that word positive just to denote, well, that's something good in our lives and okay. But I mean positive in the sense that we're motivated to fulfill something for its own inherent intrinsic value. It's a little bit like if you've ever seen the logo to MGM movies, there's at the top of it, if you've ever noticed, there's a Latin phrase, and the Latin phrase is ars gratia artis. And in case your Latin is a little rusty, they don't teach Latin that often in high school anymore, what that means is art for the sake of art. Well, our B needs are kind of like that. Sometimes you do things for their own inherent value. Sometimes you're motivated to fulfill something, hopefully something near and dear to the center of your being, because of its own inherent worth. Art for the sake of art. Life for the sake of life. I guess that would be vita gratia vitae. Life for the sake of light. And that's for you who maybe studied a little bit of Latin. Pardon my classical pronunciation, by the way. At any rate, so that's what B needs are about. D needs. Now, D needs are probably going to be a lot more accessible and a lot more obvious what's going on here. A lot of the time in life, we're motivated not to sort of fulfill these sort of higher, somewhat ethereal regions of our existence, but we're motivated towards something much more sort of immediate and much more, I guess, pressing pragmatically in a sense, and that's to fill in the gaps and deficiencies in our lives. For you young people, this is probably a real obvious one, because often when you're young, you end up working jobs that you don't particularly like, that aren't actually that much about fulfilling your very existence and your unique human birthright. You end up working jobs because you need money to pay the rent, because without your job, you wouldn't have enough money to live, or at least to live comfortably. Those are the kinds of motivations that Maslow is getting at with this D, or deficiency needs, or deficiency motivations. That's when we're motivated to sort of get what seems to be missing, and usually painfully missing, in our lives. So again, I described it as a kind of, in quotes, negative motivation, although once again, I don't mean negative in the sense of something that's bad, okay? So a deficiency need is not a bad need. It's negative in the sense that it's motivated by trying to get something that's missing, something that's not there. Okay, so negative in that sense. And like it says in your notes to the side, He also, and anyhow, I said it earlier in the video, he also uses these two prefixes, like the D prefix and the B prefix. When you get into your reading assignment, you're going to see this all over the place in many other ways. So here are some examples. B values versus D values. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's the values that would attend or go along with the fulfillment of your being, as opposed to the values that would be there and be present for the most part when you're motivated toward filling in some deficiency in your life. B cognitions versus D cognitions. So what would that be? Same game. Like, hopefully you're going to get the hang of this very quickly. The kind of cognitions, the kind of thoughts that would go along with the fulfillment of your being, as opposed to the way of thinking that's more or less there when you're trying to sort of fill in gaps and deficiencies in your lives. So, and finally, I gave you another example. I often like to use examples that young adults can relate to. So B love versus D love. Anyhow, Maslow mentions this, so it's sort of right out of the book. So the question is, what would be the difference between B love and D love? Well, if you've been following what I've been saying, probably the first obvious thing would be the kind of love. Let's limit it to romantic love. That'll probably make it easier. The kind of romantic love that would be mostly about the fulfillment of each other's existence. And maybe that would seem sort of like a little weird, or wouldn't be necessarily obvious what that would look like. But at any rate, as opposed to D-love, which would be motivated by trying to get something that's missing. Well, what would be missing in your life that you would be trying to satisfy, in a sense, by engaging the world of love? Well, here's some obvious things, like if you're lonely, if there's a lack of deep human intimacy and companionship in your life, one way you can sort of try to solve that would be to try to fall in love or enter into a love relationship. So if you enter into a love relationship because you feel lonely or not satisfied or sexually frustrated, so the sexual sphere can be part of this too, like you're not getting laid enough, if you'll permit me a slight vulgarity. Well, like if that's sort of what your love is about, is trying to sort of fill in the missing sort of pieces in the puzzle of your life, that would be a form of D-love. On the other hand, like I said a second ago, if your love relationship is really mostly about trying to invite each other and bring each other into the fullness of who and what you are as unique human beings, and who and what you are in the midst of a unique and unduplicatable intimate relationship, well, now all of a sudden it's starting to become a B form of love. So a B love, as Maslow says. Now, to sort of get this point across maybe a little bit deeper, have you ever sort of wondered about, sometimes, you know, we talk this way. We say, as an expression of love, I need you. Oh, baby, I need you, and I need you right now. And, you know, according to our standard linguistic conventions, it sounds like, well, that sounds like sort of a deep expression of love. But have you ever sort of wondered about that? It's like, well, gee, you know, like we're in this relationship, this loving relationship, a kind of relationship we think of in terms of love. But really what it's about is a kind of need. Like you need me like what? Like a drug or something? Like without it, you'll start sort of jonesing and going into the DTs or something like that. Or do you need me like you need food? Like without me, you might die? Because sort of like if your love is about that, you can wonder about whether the extent to which it's really about a kind of set of addictive dynamics more so than what love might be about, which is this vision of, you know, fulfilling the deepest sort of elements of your existence. Like if love is just a way of sort of plugging up sort of the gap or the hole in what would otherwise be sort of the leaky ship of your existence, well, you know, that's not I don't think that's a very sort of complimentary thing to say to your partner, or a very complimentary or even life-affirming way of treating your partner. I think like a much deeper expression of love than I need you would be something like, I want you. Do you hear the difference between those two? Like, I need you as opposed to I want you. So what does I want you mean? Well, what I what I want you mean, which is not something I would say that we typically say according to our prevailing linguistic conventions. What that means is I'd be fine without you. I wouldn't go into some kinds of jonesing, addictive DT type of state. That's delirium tremens. That's like what you go into, like if you're going through substance abuse withdrawal kind of symptoms. Like, I'd be fine without you, but I desire you because I sense something about our possible interactions that might lead toward a kind of completion or fulfillment of what we could possibly be and what we could possibly experience in this life. And I hope, as I'm describing this, like that second way, although it sounds kind of weird probably to hear it like, well, I desire you or I want you, to hear that sort of expression as perhaps sort of a deeper expression of love. I'm hoping it sounds that way, rather than, well, you know, you're sort of the cork that is plugging up the hole in what would otherwise be my miserable existence. Well, praise the Lord, you know, like that. I don't think that's such a deep sort of expression of love as the other one. Like, I desire you as much as I desire the fulfillment of all that is deep and powerful and radiant and luminous in my life. Now, that latter expression, I think, would be, a much more interesting, a much more powerful, and a much deeper expression of love. But at any rate, that brings us to the end of Maslow's greatest hits. And so in the next video in this series, we're going to start tracking right alongside your reading assignment. We're going to start out with Chapter 2, Out of the Farther Reaches of Human Nature. So the title of that is going to be Neurosis as a Failure of Personal Growth. But I think I'll end this video here because I don't know how good it's going to be honest. And so I don't know how long I should make these videos run either. So just sort of admitting, I guess, my own deficiencies and my own deficiency motivations possibly in making these videos. But at any rate, thanks for hanging with me. I hope these videos will get a little bit smoother and a little bit less choppy and hopefully better as I get into the process and get a little bit used to it. But hopefully that'll give you a good start thinking about Maslow. So what were those two big ideas again? What were those two greatest hits ideas? Oh yeah, I remember. First of all, the hierarchy of needs, which is basically a theory of motivation. By the way, when I said that Maslow focuses on motivation and personality, those are definitely not two separable or discrete areas, because when you think about it, like the kind of personality you have and how you're characteristically motivated pretty much overlap one another. So, you know, like how you sort of are motivated in your life in a way is an expression of your personality and vice versa. So the first idea was the hierarchy of needs. And the second idea, which is in a way running right in parallel with that hierarchy of needs, is going to be this distinction between D needs and B needs and all the other terms that he uses. And there's quite a proliferation of them. Once you get into your reading assignment, there's going to be quite a proliferation of the way he uses these prefixes. But in all of those ways, it's the same trick. So it's not that hard. It's just that whatever he has that D prefix in front of is going to have to do with the kind of motivations that are governed by deficiencies. And whatever he's using the B prefix in front of is going to have to do with the fulfillment of our being. In other words, self-actualization, which may or may not include these peak experiences. So that'll be my first attempt, and I'll see if I can sort of get this thing through the wicket and get started on some of my other classes. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being on planet Earth. Thanks for seeking out the deeper latencies of human existence with me. Thanks for being in this kind of weird space of coronavirus anxiety, which I think is ultimately a kind of mortality anxiety. I think that's really what we're anxious about. But at any rate, have a great rest of the day. I hope you enjoyed this little lecture, and like I said, I hope to do better next time. Take care. Bye-bye.